The last lines there, of course, it just depends on where you see yourself and how you fit into the whole picture, right? In a lot of models of Christianity, we call that servant leadership. And it shows up, it has a universal reality, and so it shows up many places. I had a quick overnight trip to the D.C. area, and the hotel I was staying in had 3 separate balls for the Marine Corps. Like, they just were pouring in, and I was kind of like, whatever, and I finally asked one of them, I'm like, how many are here? They said, oh, there's 3 different events going on. And man, I'd seen uniforms I've never seen before. But I've studied, some of you know I was in politics before. I used to work as a member of Congress. I did her military academy nominations. So I'm up to speed on a lot of it. But there were uniforms I'd never seen before. So I'm asking these questions. And I was on the 9th floor, and as I was coming down, on the elevator with me was a high-ranking officer. And if you do not know this about the Marines, they take servant leadership very seriously. And the simplest way it gets lived out is, everyone know there's these 3 words: officers eat last. Officers eat last. And so in the mess hall, the leaders aren't the ones to eat first, they eat last. And it's really in reflection to what's being said here. And so I decided to use this against my new friend here on the elevator, as his wife in this beautiful gown, the doors open and she gets off, and he said, sir? And I said, sir? And we had a standoff. We had a servant leader standoff. And I winked and said, officers eat last. Sir? He just smiled. Sir? So I let him be the servant leader. I walked off first. But that really is at the root of it, because if we don't practice it every day, how are we going to get there? This reading starts out being about me, right, as priest. Widening the phylacteries and long robes, not practicing what you preach. I bring this up from time to time. Like anyone, I love to complain about things. And by the way, allow me to complain about how with the time change, clearly all the lights that were in sequence are no longer in sequence. And it was a bit frustrating to get here. From the first lights, okay, it's just... To this day, the most watched homily I've done is the one on traffic from about 1.5 years ago. So if you haven't seen it, it's worth... I don't like to watch it again. That's my point. Sometimes when I'm complaining, people go, well, it's like you said in your homily. And then they throw my homily back in my face. And I say, those aren't for me. They're for you. But the reality is, right, that's the practice. We have to confront it. And I often say, hey, I only preach for me. I tell Geoff what Geoff needs to hear. If you like it, it's because you're on a similar journey. That's how it works. And so this gospel starts with something that you might not have caught. It said, Jesus said to the crowd and his disciples. That exact phrase is only used one other time in Matthew's gospel, and it's the Sermon on the Mount. It says he spoke to the crowd and his disciples. And those were the reading of blessing. And what follows the verses we just heard after he says, first will be last, and humble yourself. It goes, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. So you had blessings in chapter 5, and we get the woes, the curses in chapter 12. But at the root of it is, how do we see our role? What we're doing with the internal work is really going to be what defines us. Jews have this great parable about a young man who's trying to achieve holiness, and he comes to his rabbi, and he says, I think I've done it. Oh, tell me about it. He said, well, I've been working really hard. I do the things that people don't want to do. I do those difficult things. I fast. I pray. I use the self-discipline, as they say, like to kind of whip oneself to be sorry for their sins. He goes through all these things, and he said, so I think I've achieved it, holiness. And the rabbi takes him to the window and says, see that horse out there? Yeah, I've been watching him all day. And he does all this work that he didn't ask to do. And he hasn't eaten or drinking anything all day. And he gets whipped when he doesn't do what he's supposed to do. Is he a horse or is he a saint? That work and that effort doesn't mean anything to holiness. It really doesn't. We can work hard and we can do all the externals. But if it isn't rooted in gratitude, if the starting point isn't gratitude, I think I'm borrowing this from Father Ron Rolheiser when he said, of course, that's the first sin of Adam and Eve. It was a sin of receptivity and gratitude. That God gave them everything. Everything but one tree. You get the whole thing but the one tree, and their focus became, why not this tree? What's there about this tree? Right? And we still live this every day. You go to the restaurant, and the waiter puts a plate in front of you and says, careful, the plate is hot. And we say, oh, let's see about that. Right? That's all that is. Within us is that lack of gratitude in that moment. There's something in us that doesn't trust it. You're standing on the subway platform. Do not stand across this line. This one? Nothing seemed to happen. Right? Rather than to say, where's the gratitude? And you may think this is silly, but it's how it gets lived out. And particularly for rabbis and priests and ministers. Oh, Father, you go first. Yes, I should go first in the meal line. I'm important and I have things to do. That's not how this works. Not for any of us, and least among in leadership. So whether or not you participate in leadership in that way, it has to be rooted in gratitude. That we just stop and say, it's all gift, all of it. I'm not owed any of it. On any of us. Our life, our love, our care, none of it. We're not owed it. Because the minute that idea creeps into our head, we start to compare, we start to contrast, we start to feel jealous, we start to resent other people. Rather in the moment to be grateful. As God would have it, this happened powerfully to me late last week and to the start of this week. And there's a brother oblate of mine had died, and he and both his brother are oblates. He was the oldest and the second oldest. They're both oblates. So his brother called and said, it's in his directions and will, if possible, could you preach his funeral? Well, he died in Niagara Falls. And just being the human selfish jerk that I am and being very busy, I'm like, God, I hope my calendar is full. Right? That's just my response. It was on Thursday. And as I opened my calendar, because I'd have to go up Monday night, right? And then this funeral's Tuesday. And I look, I have nothing Monday night and nothing Tuesday morning. Crap! And I mean, I loved, he was a good brother. It's not that. It's just like, drive to Niagara Falls, 5.5 hours there, 5.5 hours back. Right? Me. I'm important. I've got stuff to do, blah, blah, blah. So I say, absolutely, Stu. As God would have it, my calendar is clear. I'd be happy to do it. And you know what? In the end, I was happy to do it. And really the gift it was to Stu, his living brother, who is now the last one left. He had a younger brother who had died many years ago. Right? But once it's based in gratitude to go, look, my day is not mine. My gifts are not mine. The fact that he put me down to preach that, what an honor. Right? Rather than to look at it as a distraction or a disruption into my schedule. If only I had gotten there sooner, right? But in that moment, I was just being very human. Blech, I don't want to do this. But it's got to start with the gratitude. That is the most important religious attitude. And if you want a bumper sticker, have an attitude of gratitude, right? We've got to start there. Because that's the life of Jesus. If we don't, going back to Adam and Eve, if we don't receive and are grateful, we'll never break and share. We won't. That's what happened for me in that moment, and I have as many stories of failing at that as I have successes of being faithful to it. But it's only in the practice, it's only in the everyday where I can look at it and say, I want to start with gratitude. I'm grateful that I can do that. I'm grateful that I do get to drive here, even though every light was out of sequence. Right? But if I focus on the out of sequence, I've broke the second rule of life. Right? I've given you the 5 truths. The first one is life is hard. And many people in the world fully accept that truth as it is because they've always experienced it that way. But for those of us who don't experience it that way all the time, we struggle with truth number 1. Life is hard. And the second one is also very difficult for us in the first world, and that is, you're not important. You're not important. And by the way, that doesn't mean you don't have infinite value. You do. You're made in the image and likeness of God. But in order to be important, someone has to be unimportant. To be at the front of the line means that everyone else has to move back one space or more. And so in that moment, when I'm frustrated with the sequence of lights, I can just say, you know what, I'm not that important. I'm certainly not any more important than anyone else. And so then my energy becomes not about what is happening to me, but it becomes about all of us. And then we're participating in that unitive consciousness when Jesus said it, that they would be one, Father, as you and I are one. But until we make that the starting point, we're going to hate each other. We're going to look at the differences. We're going to drive wedges with people. We'll do it within the church. We'll do it within our community. And we'll certainly do it within our world where there are people that we don't have to interact with. And it's just easier to call them names and set them apart. But that's not God's vision. That what Jesus is going to give us in this Eucharist starts with gratitude. That as the second person of the Trinity said, I'm going to go to earth. Why? Because it's what they need. It's not what Jesus needs. He doesn't need it at all. But he says out of gratitude, and he receives that gratitude, he comes to us. And then he is broken. And then he can be shared. And so this Eucharist isn't so much a vitamin or a medicine as it is this participation in who he is. So that when we leave here, we can be a little bit more like that. That we would start with the humility to go, I'm not God. We would continue with the humility that says, we're in this together. And I'm grateful that we get to be in this together. We were made for this space and time. And there's a lot about this space and time that might feel tumultuous and difficult. We've gone through a global pandemic. All and on and on and on. But you and I were made for this moment. We were made for this moment. And it wasn't to scream and yell at each other. It was to be grateful first, and then to share the greatness and goodness of God with others. We'll always have that opportunity. But if we don't start with gratitude, it'll be really hard to get there. So let us re-accept that invitation today, that as you come forward for this Eucharist, that we all realize we're not coming to it worthy, but we're coming to it because he called us to it. So that when we leave here, it's more humble, more grateful, that we would be gentle and humble of heart, just as the one we will receive. So that the world out there that needs peace, that needs mercy, that needs to know God's love, might know that because of our gentle, humble, grateful witness. It's a heck of a challenge, brothers and sisters. We will not do it alone, and we will not do it without his presence. So let us accept the invitation again this morning. May God be praised.